The blood on her hands was still warm when she decided the calf would be called Mercy, and that single word, spoken to a creature barely breathing, would change everything between them. Sarah Whitmore had arrived in Abilene, Kansas, 3 weeks earlier on a dusty September afternoon in 1877, carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter of introduction to her uncle's ranch. The journey from Philadelphia had taken nearly 2 weeks, and every mile had stripped away another layer of the refined young woman she had been. Her mother had died that spring, consumption taking her slowly and painfully, and her father had followed within a month, his heart simply giving out. At 22 years old, Sarah found herself alone in the world except for her mother's brother, a man she had met only once as a child, who owned a cattle ranch in Kansas and had grudgingly agreed to take her in. The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prairie grassland, a sea of amber and gold that stretched to meet the endless sky. Uncle Thomas Whitmore was a hard man, weathered by decades of sun and wind, his face carved into permanent lines of skepticism. He had not been pleased to inherit a niece, especially one raised in the city with soft hands and softer expectations, but blood was blood, and he had given her a room in the ranch house and a list of chores that would have broken most women unused to physical labor. Sarah learned quickly because she had no other choice. She learned to collect eggs without getting pecked, to churn butter until her arms screamed, to mend fences and haul water and scrub floors until her back ached. The ranch hands mostly ignored her, these rough men who smelled of horses and tobacco and spent their days in the saddle. They thought she would not last a month, that she would run back to civilization begging for the comforts she had known. She heard them betting on it one evening, their voices carrying across the yard as she hung laundry in the fading light. That had only made her more determined to prove them wrong. The morning she found the calf, she had been walking to the south pasture to check on a water trough that kept leaking. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of rose and lavender, and the air still held the cool kiss of night. The cattle were dark shapes against the grass, most of them still lying down, chewing cud in that peaceful pre-dawn stillness. But something caught her eye near the fence line, a disturbance in the natural rhythm of the herd. The cow was a young heifer, barely 3 years old herself, and she was in trouble. Sarah had been around the ranch long enough now to recognize distress in an animal. The heifer was lying on her side, her breathing labored, and there was blood. Too much blood. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the cow, her heart hammering. She had witnessed exactly one birth since arriving at the ranch, and that had been straightforward, the calf slipping into the world with practiced ease while the mother barely seemed to notice. This was nothing like that. The calf was stuck. She could see that much. One tiny hoof was visible, but it should have been two, should have been a nose by now. The heifer made a sound that was almost human in its pain, her eyes rolling white with fear. Sarah looked around desperately for help, but the pasture was empty. The ranch hands still at breakfast in the bunkhouse a quarter-mile away. By the time she ran for help and brought someone back, it might be too late for both mother and baby. Her hands were shaking as she rolled up her sleeves. She had no experience with this, no knowledge beyond the basic understanding that something was terribly wrong and someone had to do something. The heifer struggled weakly as Sarah reached inside, following the visible leg up to find what was blocking the birth. The calf's head was turned back, tucked against its shoulder instead of pointed forward like it should be. Sarah had to close her eyes, working by feel alone, her fingers finding the small muzzle and trying to guide it forward. The heifer bellowed and kicked, catching Sarah in the ribs hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs, but she did not let go. She could not let go. There were 2 lives depending on her fumbling, inexperienced hands, and if she failed them both would die here in the grass with no one to witness it but her. She gritted her teeth and pushed past the pain in her side, past the fear that she was doing everything wrong, past the voice in her head that said she was just a city girl playing at being a rancher. Her fingers found purchase, and she pulled, guided, prayed to a god she was not entirely sure was listening. The head came forward. The second leg followed. And then with a rush of fluid and blood that soaked Sarah's dress and arms, the calf was born. It lay motionless in the grass, a small heap of wet brown and white, and Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She had been too late after all, too slow, too inexperienced, too much of a useless city girl, just like the ranch hands whispered. But then she remembered something she had read once in a book, back when books and reading seemed like the most important things in the world. She grabbed handfuls of grass and began rubbing the calf's sides vigorously, stimulating it, trying to force life into the small body. "Come on," she whispered, rubbing harder. "Come on, please. You did not come this far to give up now." The heifer had struggled to her feet and was watching with that blank bovine stare that revealed nothing. Sarah kept rubbing, kept whispering, kept refusing to accept that her desperate intervention had been for nothing. Her arms burned with exhaustion. Her blood and birth fluid covered her from wrist to shoulder. The sun was fully up now, turning the prairie into a golden cathedral, and still the calf did not move. And then it did. Just a twitch at first, one ear flickering, then a shudder that ran the length of its small body. And then miraculously, impossibly, its chest expanded with a breath. Its eyes opened, dark and wet and wondering. It lifted its head an inch off the ground and bleated, a small sound that was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. "Mercy," she said, the word coming from somewhere deep inside her, from a place she did not know she possessed. "Your name is Mercy because that is what you are. You are mercy itself." The calf was not even trying to stand yet, was still lying in the grass taking those first precious breaths. But Sarah had named her anyway, had claimed her with a word and a promise that this creature would live. She did not hear the horse approach, did not realize she was not alone until a shadow fell across her and a voice said, "That was the damnedest thing I have ever seen." Sarah looked up, squinting against the sun, and found herself staring at a man on horseback. He sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, the reins loose in his other hand. He was tall. She could tell that even with him mounted, with broad shoulders and lean hips. His hat shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jaw, a mouth that might have been smiling. He wore the same dusty clothes as all the ranch hands, denim and leather and cotton worn soft with use, but there was something different about him, some quality of self-possession that set him apart. "I did not know anyone was there," Sarah said, suddenly aware of how she must look, covered in blood and birth fluid, her hair falling from its pins, her dress ruined beyond any hope of salvaging. "I was riding fence when I saw you heading out here. Figured I would check that the trough got fixed." He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, ground-tying the reins and walking over to crouch beside her. "Jake Coleman, I have been working on your uncle's ranch for about 5 years now." Sarah blinked. She knew that name, had heard Uncle Thomas mention him. Jake Coleman was the foreman, the man who ran the day-to-day operations of the ranch, who managed the other hands and made decisions about the herd. She had never met him because he had been gone for the past 3 weeks, driving a portion of the cattle to market in Kansas City. He had only returned last night. "Sarah Whitmore," she said, feeling foolish for introducing herself on her own uncle's property. "I know who you are. I mean, I have heard your name." Jake was looking at the calf, which was now making determined, if unsuccessful, efforts to get its legs underneath itself. The heifer had started licking it, that rough maternal attention that would clean and dry and encourage. "You turned that calf yourself?" he asked, glancing at Sarah with eyes that were a startling shade of blue-green, like shallow water over sand. "There was no one else. I did not know if I was doing it right. I was terrified I would kill them both." "You probably should have," he said bluntly, "trying something like that with no experience, but you did not kill them. You saved them. That heifer would have died if you had not intervened. The calf, too. Hell, even knowing what to do, it is not always enough. Sarah felt something warm unfold in her chest at his words. It was not quite pride, not quite relief, but something in between. Validation, perhaps. Proof that she was more than what the ranch hands thought her to be. Mercy, Jake said softly, and Sarah realized he had heard her naming the calf. That is a good name. Fitting. I did not even think about it, it just came out. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, his gaze traveling over her bloody arms and soiled dress and tangled hair. But there was no judgment in his eyes, no mockery. Instead, there was something else, something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. You named that calf before it was even standing, he said, and his voice had gone rough around the edges, and somehow that made me love you. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and true. Sarah stared at him, unable to speak, unable to process what he had just said. They were strangers, had known each other for all of 5 minutes, covered in the mess and mystery of birth under a Kansas sky. It was ridiculous. It was insane. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw that he meant it, every word. You do not know me, she managed to say. No, he agreed. But I know that you came out here alone at dawn to fix a water trough, which is not in any job description your uncle gave you. I know that you did not run for help when you found that heifer in trouble. You just rolled up your sleeves and did what needed doing. I know that you fought for that calf like it was the most important thing in the world, and when it finally breathed, you gave it a name that meant something. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, Sarah Whitmore. The calf finally managed to get its front legs straightened, though its back end was still folded under it. It swayed there, nose pointing at the sky, determined and ridiculous and perfect. Sarah watched it, her heart too full for her chest to contain. When she finally looked back at Jake, she found him still watching her with that same intensity. I should get back to the house, she said, though she made no move to stand. I need to clean up. Uncle Thomas will be wondering where I am. Thomas knows I rode out here. He'll figure you got held up. Jake stood and offered his hand to help her up. Sarah hesitated only a moment before taking it, his palm warm and calloused against hers. He pulled her to her feet with easy strength, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could smell the scent of him, leather and sage and something clean underneath. Will you have dinner with me? The words tumbled out of Jake's mouth like he had not meant to say them, like they had escaped of their own accord. There is a restaurant in town, decent food, nothing fancy but respectable. Tomorrow night if you are willing. Sarah knew she should say no, knew that accepting would be reckless, would be encouraging something that had no business being encouraged. They were still strangers, no matter what he thought he had seen in her. She was living on her uncle's charity, dependent on his goodwill for her very survival. Getting involved with the foreman could complicate everything. But the calf had just taken its first wobbling steps toward its mother, legs splayed wide, moving with the drunk uncertainty of the newly born, and Jake Coleman was looking at her like she had hung the moon and stars, like she was something precious instead of just another mouth to feed. Yes, she heard herself say, I will have dinner with you. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. 6 o'clock then. I will come to the house to collect you. He swung back into his saddle with that same easy grace, tipped his hat to her, and rode off toward the fence line he had been checking. Sarah stood there in the grass covered in blood and birth fluid, watching him go, and wondered what on earth she had just agreed to. By the time she made it back to the ranch house, her dress was stiffening with dried blood and her hair was a complete disaster. Uncle Thomas took one look at her from where he sat on the porch, nursing his morning coffee, and raised his eyebrows. Jake told me you turned a calf, said you probably saved the heifer's life. I did not know what else to do. There was no time to get help. Her uncle studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. You did good, girl. Real good. Most people would have panicked or run off crying. You got backbone. More than I gave you credit for. The praise, grudging as it was, meant more than Sarah could have articulated. She ducked her head, suddenly embarrassed. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas." "Calf going to make it?" "I think so. She was standing when I left, trying to nurse. Good stock, that heifer. Be glad not to lose her." He took another sip of his coffee, then added, as if it was an afterthought, "Jake is a good man. Steady, honest. If he has taken an interest in you, you could do worse." Sarah felt heat flood her face. "I do not know what you mean," her uncle snorted. "I am old, not blind. I saw the way he looked when he rode back in just now, like he had been hit upside the head with a 2x4. And you are blushing like a schoolgirl. So I reckon the interest runs both ways." "He asked me to dinner," Sarah admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "In town tomorrow night." "Then you best say yes if you have not already. Like I said, good man, works hard, does not drink to excess, does not start fights. Been foreman here for 2 years and I've never had cause to regret promoting him. You could find worse in a lot of looking." Sarah did not know what to say to that. Her uncle had never been one for personal conversations, had barely spoken to her beyond giving orders since she arrived. This sudden benediction on a potential courtship left her off balance. "I already agreed to go," she said finally. Thomas nodded his approval. "Good. Now get yourself cleaned up before you track blood all through the house, and for God's sake, burn that dress. It is beyond saving." Sarah fled inside, grateful for the excuse to escape. She heated water on the stove and filled the wash basin in her room, scrubbing away the evidence of the morning's drama. Her dress joined the rag pile, just as her uncle had suggested. When she was finally clean and dressed in a simple calico day dress, she sat on the edge of her bed and tried to make sense of what had happened. Jake Coleman thought he loved her. Had said it out loud, matter of fact as stating the weather. It was insane. It was impossible. Love did not work that way, did not strike like lightning in a single moment. Love was something that grew slowly over time, through shared experiences and deepening understanding. At least that was what she had always believed, but there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that made her think maybe love was not always the slow burn she had imagined. Maybe sometimes it was exactly this, instant and undeniable, sparked by the right person at the right moment doing something that revealed the truth of who they were. She had named that calf Mercy before it could even stand, and somehow that simple act had reached inside Jake Coleman and found something essential. She did not fully understand it, but she could not deny the flutter in her chest when she thought about seeing him again. About sitting across from him at dinner, learning the shape of his voice and the stories he carried, about the possibility of something real growing between them. The rest of that day passed in a blur of ordinary chores. Sarah baked bread, weeded the kitchen garden, mended a tear in one of her uncle's shirts. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the morning over and over. The feel of the calf under her hands fighting for life, the moment it had breathed, Jake's voice saying he loved her, rough and honest and completely unexpected. That evening after supper, she walked back out to the south pasture to check on Mercy and her mother. The heifer and calf were both doing well, the baby stronger now, moving with more confidence. When Sarah approached, Mercy came toward her on wobbly legs, curious and unafraid. Sarah ran her hand over the soft hide, feeling the warmth and solidity of the little creature. "You are going to be just fine," she whispered. "We both are." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah changed her dress 3 times before settling on a pale blue cotton with tiny white flowers, the nicest thing she owned that was suitable for a dinner in a frontier town. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, leaving a few tendrils to frame her face, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. Her cheeks were flushed with anticipation, her brown eyes bright. She looked like a woman on the edge of something, nervous and hopeful in equal measure. Jake arrived precisely at 6, riding up to the house on a handsome bay gelding. He had cleaned up too, Sarah noticed, wearing a shirt that was actually pressed and trousers without any visible patches. He had shaved, his jaw smooth and strong, and when he smiled at her, her stomach did a little flip. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was such simple honesty in his voice that Sarah believed him. "Thank you. You look very nice yourself." He helped her up onto his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to keep her steady. The ride into town took 20 minutes, and Sarah was acutely aware of every place their bodies touched, of the warmth of him against her back, of his breath stirring the loose tendrils of her hair. They talked of small things, the weather and the cattle and the repairs needed on the north fence line, but underneath the ordinary words was a current of something else, a hum of possibility. Abilene in 1877 was a far cry from Philadelphia, but it had a certain rough charm. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired from holding themselves upright against the endless prairie wind. The restaurant Jake chose was called the Cattleman's Rest, and it was cleaner than Sarah had expected, with checkered tablecloths and actual glass in the windows. The owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Henderson, greeted Jake by name and showed them to a table near the back. "I come here when I have been out on a cattle drive," Jake explained once they were seated. "Mrs. Henderson makes the best roast beef west of the Mississippi, and her apple pie is something close to divine." They ordered the roast beef, and while they waited for the food, they talked. Really talked in a way Sarah had not talked to anyone since her mother died. Jake told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father dying when he was 14, and his mother remarrying a man who did not want another man's children underfoot. He had struck out on his own at 16, working ranches across Kansas and Nebraska, learning the cattle business from the ground up. "I was a terrible cowhand at first," he admitted, with a grin that was self-deprecating and charming. "Could barely stay in the saddle, was afraid of my own shadow. But I was stubborn, and I learned. Figured out that if I worked twice as hard as everyone else, I could make up for not knowing things. And slowly I got better. Got good enough that Thomas Whitmore offered me the foreman position 2 years ago, and that felt like winning the lottery." "Do you like it, being foreman?" "I do. I like the responsibility, like knowing that the ranch runs well because of decisions I make, and Thomas is a good man to work for. Fair, which is rarer than you might think. Some ranch owners treat their hands like chattel, but Thomas respects the men who work for him, expects hard work, but pays fair wages, and does not ask anything he would not do himself." Sarah found herself relaxing as they talked, the initial nervousness fading into something more comfortable. Jake was easy to be with, his manner straightforward and without pretense. He asked about her life in Philadelphia, and she told him about her childhood, about her parents and the quiet house on Chestnut Street, about her mother's illness and her father's grief. "I thought I would die there too," she said softly, "in that house, in that city. I thought my life was over when they died, that there was nothing left for me. Coming here felt like exile, like being sent away to a place where I did not belong." "And now?" Jake asked, his eyes intent on her face. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is where I was supposed to end up all along. Maybe everything that happened was leading me here." The food arrived, and it was as good as Jake had promised. They ate and talked, and when the apple pie came, they shared a slice, their forks clinking companionably. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the restaurant was lit by oil lamps that cast warm golden light across the tables. Other diners had come and gone, but Sarah had barely noticed them. Her entire world had narrowed to the man across from her, to the sound of his voice, and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. When they finally left, the night air was cool and full of stars. Jake helped Sarah back onto his horse, and they rode back toward the ranch at a leisurely pace. Halfway there, he pulled the horse to a stop on a small rise that overlooked the prairie. In the moonlight, the grassland stretched out like a silver sea rippling in the night breeze. "I meant what I said yesterday, Jake said quietly, "about loving you. I know it is fast, know it probably does not make any sense, but I have been around long enough to know when something is real. And this is real, Sarah. What I feel for you is real." Sarah turned in the saddle to face him, and in the moonlight his features were all plains and shadows, beautiful and slightly unreal. "I barely know you," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Then let me court you properly. Let me take you to dances and church socials. Let me walk with you in the evenings and show you the places on this land that I love. Give me time to prove that what I feel is not just some passing fancy, that it is something worth building a life on." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Everything sensible in her said she should slow down, should be cautious, should protect herself against the possibility of hurt. But there was another voice, quieter but insistent, that said life was short and uncertain, that her parents had been young when they died, that sometimes you had to take a risk or spend your whole life wondering what might have been. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Court me, Jake Coleman. Show me what you mean." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, his lips warm against hers. It was Sarah's first kiss, and it sent sparks racing through her veins, made her feel like she was made of light and heat and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Jake rested his forehead against hers for a long moment. "I am going to marry you," he said, and it was not a question, it was a promise. "Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but someday. I'm going to marry you and spend the rest of my life making you happy." That is a bold claim from someone who just got permission to court me. I know what I want, and what I want is you. They rode the rest of the way back to the ranch in comfortable silence, Sarah leaning back against Jake's chest, his arms secure around her waist. When they reached the house, he helped her down and walked her to the door, kissing her once more under the porch light before riding off toward the bunkhouse where he had his own small room. Sarah floated into the house, feeling like she was walking on air. Her uncle looked up from the book he was reading by lamplight. "Good dinner?" "Very good," Sarah said, unable to keep the smile off her face. "Figured as much. You have that look about you." "What look?" "The look of a woman who has been properly courted by a man who knows what he is about." Thomas closed his book and studied her over his reading glasses. "Jake is good people, Sarah. Treat him right, and he will treat you right. That is about all you can ask for in this world." "I will," Sarah promised. "I intend to." The next weeks unfolded like a dream. Jake courted Sarah with a single-minded determination that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. He found reasons to be near her during the day, helping with chores that did not strictly require his attention, stealing moments to talk or just be in her presence. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would walk together around the ranch, and Jake would point out features of the land, telling her stories about the cattle and the seasons and the rhythm of ranch life. He took her to a dance in town where they spun around the floor to fiddle music until Sarah was breathless and laughing. He brought her wildflowers picked from the prairie, simple bouquets of black-eyed Susans and purple cone flowers that she kept in a mason jar on the kitchen table. He taught her to ride properly, putting her on a gentle mare named Daisy and showing her how to sit the saddle, how to communicate with the horse through pressure and balance. Sarah found herself falling in love with him in increments, small moments that added up to something undeniable. The way he was patient when teaching her something new, never mocking her mistakes. The way he spoke to the horses and cattle, his voice low and soothing. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, like she was something precious he could not quite believe was real. Mercy the calf grew strong and healthy, and Sarah visited her every day, bringing treats and scratching behind her ears. Jake would often join her, leaning on the fence and watching with that soft smile that made Sarah's heart skip. "She is going to be trouble," he said one evening, as Mercy frolicked around the pasture, kicking up her heels. "Too friendly by half, probably thinks she's a dog instead of a cow." "Is that a bad thing?" "No. Just means she'll be one of those cows that comes when called, that hangs around the barn looking for attention. We have a few like that. They make ranch life interesting." "Like pets." "Exactly like pets. Though do not let your uncle hear you call them that. He prefers to think of the herd as livestock, not companions." Sarah laughed, leaning into Jake's side. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they stood there in the gathering dusk watching Mercy play. And Sarah thought she had never been happier in her entire life. But happiness, as Sarah was about to learn, was never guaranteed to last. It started with small things, cattle going missing, just one or two at a time, easy to explain away as strays wandering off. Then the south fence was cut, clearly, deliberately, and a dozen head got loose. Jake and the ranch hands spent 2 days rounding them up, and they still came back short 3. Thomas Whitmore's face grew grimmer with each incident, and the men started carrying rifles when they rode out, no longer trusting the prairie to be peaceful. "Rustlers," Jake explained to Sarah one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "They have been hitting ranches all up and down this part of Kansas, take enough cattle to make a profit, but not enough at any one ranch to justify bringing in the law. By the time we realize stock is missing, they have driven them halfway to Missouri and sold them. Is there nothing that can be done? Thomas is talking to some of the other ranchers, seeing if they can organize patrols, keep an eye on each other's land, but it is a lot of territory to cover, and the rustlers know the country as well as we do. Maybe better." Sarah did not like the worry she saw in Jake's eyes, did not like the new tension that had settled over the ranch. The hands were jumpy, quick to anger, and more than once she heard raised voices from the bunkhouse at night. Her uncle started sleeping with his rifle beside his bed, and he insisted Sarah do the same. "I do not know how to shoot," she protested. "Then it is past time you learned. Jake, teach her." So Jake took her out to a makeshift range behind the barn and put a rifle in her hands, showing her how to load it, how to aim, how to absorb the kick against her shoulder. Sarah hated everything about it. Hated the noise and the smell of gunpowder and the way the rifle bruised her shoulder. But she practiced anyway because Jake was worried, and her uncle was worried, and she would be damned if she was going to be helpless if trouble came calling. Trouble came on a cold October night, 6 weeks after that first dinner in town. Sarah woke to the sound of shouting and gunfire, her heart immediately leaping into her throat. She grabbed the rifle from beside her bed, her hands shaking, and ran to the window. In the moonlight, she could see men on horseback, dark shapes moving fast, and the cattle in the nearest pasture were bawling in distress, milling in confusion. More gunfire, the sharp crack of it echoing across the prairie. Sarah saw Jake burst out of the bunkhouse, rifle in hand, saw him take cover behind a water trough and fire toward the riders. Her uncle was on the porch, his own rifle barking, and the other ranch hands were spilling out of the bunkhouse, adding their firepower to the fight. The rustlers returned fire, and Sarah heard a bullet slam into the side of the house, splintering wood. She dropped below the window, her breath coming in panicked gasps. This was not supposed to happen. This kind of violence was something from dime novels, not real life. But it was real, terribly real, and people were going to get hurt. Or worse. The fight seemed to last forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the rustlers realized they were outgunned, or decided the fight was not worth the trouble, and they wheeled their horses and rode off into the darkness, driving a small knot of cattle ahead of them. The firing tapered off, then stopped entirely, leaving only the sound of frightened cattle and men calling to each other in the sudden quiet. Sarah set the rifle down with shaking hands and ran outside. Jake was already on his feet, checking himself for injuries, and relief flooded through her when she saw he was unharmed. He saw her and crossed the yard in long strides, pulling her into his arms so hard it hurt. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear and adrenaline. I am fine. Are you hurt?" No, I am good." He held her at arm's length, his eyes sweeping over her as if to verify for himself that she was whole and unhurt. "You need to get back inside. They might come back." "Is anyone hurt?" "I do not know yet. I need to check on the men." He kissed her hard and fast, then went to do exactly that. Sarah stood in the yard hugging herself, watching as Jake and her uncle moved among the hands, assessing damage. Miraculously, no one had been hit, though one of the bunkhouse windows was shattered, and there were bullet holes in the barn wall. The rustlers had gotten away with maybe 8 head of cattle, a small number all things considered, but the violation of it burned. They had come onto Whitmore land, had shot at Whitmore men, and Sarah could see the rage on her uncle's face even from a distance. "We are going after them," Thomas announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Get saddled up. We leave in 10 minutes. "Uncle Thomas, is that wise?" Sarah asked, finding her voice. "It is dark. They could be anywhere." "They are heading east. We can follow the trail, and I will be damned if I let them get away with this." "Sir, maybe we should wait for daylight," one of the hands suggested. "We will be able to track better, and it will be safer." "By daylight, they will be long gone. We go now." Jake caught Sarah's eye, and she could see the conflict on his face. He did not want to leave her, but he also could not let the other men ride out without him. He was the foreman. It was his job to lead. "Stay in the house," he said, coming back over to her. "Keep that rifle close. We will be back before you know it. Please be careful." "I will. I promise." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise and a prayer. Then he was swinging up onto his horse, and the men were riding out in a tight group, following the trail of disturbed earth and frightened cattle. Sarah went back inside, but she did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen with the rifle across her lap, watching the eastern horizon for any sign of dawn, and prayed harder than she had prayed for anything in her life, that Jake would come back to her safe. The men returned just after sunrise, riding in slow and weary. They had not caught the rustlers, who had scattered once they realized they were being pursued, driving the stolen cattle in different directions to confuse the trail. Thomas was in a foul mood, snapping at anyone who came near him, and Jake looked exhausted, dust covering him from head to toe. Sarah met him at the barn, handing him a cup of coffee without a word. He drank it gratefully, then pulled her into another embrace. "I am sorry I worried you," he said into her hair. "I am just glad you are back. This is not over. They will hit us again, or hit one of the neighboring ranches. We need to figure out who they are and put a stop to it." "How?" "I do not know yet, but we will figure something out." The attacks continued sporadically over the next few weeks, keeping everyone on edge. The Whitmore ranch was hit twice more, though with the men now on high alert, the rustlers did not manage to take many cattle. Other ranches in the area reported similar problems, and tensions ran high. There was talk of vigilante justice, of forming posses to hunt down the rustlers and string them up without trial. Thomas refused to participate in such talk, insisting they do things legal and proper, but Sarah could see the strain it put on him. Through it all, Jake remained a steadying presence. He worked harder than ever, organizing patrols and coordinating with other ranches, trying to establish patterns that might help them predict where the rustlers would strike next. He was exhausted, running himself ragged, but he never complained. And every evening, no matter how tired he was, he made time for Sarah, sitting with her on the porch or walking with her to check on Mercy, holding her hand and stealing kisses and reminding her that there was more to life than fear and vigilance. "Marry me," he said one night in early November. They were sitting on a bench behind the barn, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the stars wheel overhead. "I know we have only known each other a few months, and I know the timing is terrible with everything going on, but I do not want to wait. Life is too uncertain, and I want you to be my wife. I want to wake up next to you every morning and go to bed next to you every night. I want to build a life with you, Sarah. Will you marry me?" Sarah's breath caught. She had known this was coming, had felt it in every touch and every look, but hearing the actual words still sent her heart racing. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily, without hesitation or doubt. "Yes, I will marry you, Jake Coleman." His smile was brilliant even in the darkness. He produced a simple gold band from his pocket, a plain circle without adornment, and slipped it onto her finger. "It was my grandmother's Hudabrayets," he said. "The only thing my mother gave me when I left home. I have been carrying it for 10 years, waiting for the right woman." "Waiting for you." Sarah looked at the ring, warm on her finger, and felt tears prick her eyes. "It is perfect." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Abilene, with Uncle Thomas and a handful of ranch hands as witnesses. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, and Jake wore his Sunday best, his hair slicked back and his face shaved smooth. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Jake kissed her, Sarah felt like the world had rearranged itself into something brighter and more hopeful than it had been before. They moved into Jake's quarters in the bunkhouse temporarily, the small room barely big enough for the two of them, but Sarah did not care. She was with Jake, and that was all that mattered. Uncle Thomas promised to build them a small house come spring, a place of their own on the ranch, but for now they made do with what they had. Marriage suited them both. Sarah discovered that she liked waking up in Jake's arms, liked the domesticity of cooking for him and mending his clothes and sharing a bed. Jake was an attentive husband, always conscious of her comfort, always making sure she knew she was loved. They were still learning each other, still discovering the rhythms of shared life, but it felt right in a way that nothing else ever had. The rustler problem finally came to a head in early December. One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Henry Carlson, had set a trap, leaving a small herd in an isolated pasture and then staking out the area with armed men. The rustlers took the bait, and when they rode in to make their move, they found themselves surrounded. There was a brief firefight, and when it was over, 3 rustlers were dead and 2 more were captured alive. The captured men talked, naming names and locations, and within a week the law had rounded up the rest of the gang. It turned out to be a group of drifters from Missouri, men who had turned to cattle rustling when honest work proved too hard or too scarce. They were tried and convicted, sentenced to long prison terms, and the threat that had hung over the ranches for months finally lifted. Life on the Whitmore ranch returned to something approaching normal. The cattle that had been stolen were long gone, sold and slaughtered, but the remaining herd was healthy and growing. Thomas Whitmore's temper improved dramatically, and he threw himself into planning for the spring, talking about expanding the herd and buying more land. He also made good on his promise to build Jake and Sarah a house, hiring carpenters from town to construct a small but sturdy cabin on a rise overlooking the south pasture. The cabin was finished by late February, just as the prairie was beginning to think about spring. It had 2 rooms, a main living area that served as kitchen and sitting room, and a bedroom barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. There was a small porch with a view that stretched for miles, and a fireplace that kept the interior warm even on the coldest nights. It was not much by Philadelphia standards, but to Sarah it was a palace. It was hers and Jake's, their first real home together, and she loved every inch of it. They moved in on a crisp March morning, carrying their few possessions across the yard. Sarah hung curtains she had sewn herself, placed wildflowers in a jar on the table, and stood in the middle of their little cabin feeling absurdly proud. Jake came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and kissed the top of her head. "Welcome home, Mrs. Coleman." "It is perfect," Sarah said, leaning back against him. "Absolutely perfect." Spring came in a rush of green and warmth, the prairie transforming from dull brown to vibrant color. The cattle were turned out into new pastures, and the ranch hummed with activity. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in April, the realization coming slowly and then all at once. She told Jake one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, picking her up and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, like he could not quite believe it. "We are having an actual baby." "We are. In late October, I think, if I have calculated correctly." "October, that is perfect. The fall work will be done. I can take time to help you to be there." He knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I'm already so excited to meet you." Sarah ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was happiness, she realized. This moment, this man, this life they were building together. It was everything she had never known she wanted, everything she had been searching for without realizing it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Sarah continued to work around the ranch, though Jake fussed over her constantly, trying to convince her to rest more, to take it easy. She ignored him for the most part, continuing to tend the garden and cook meals and walk out to visit Mercy, who had grown into a beautiful young cow, glossy and healthy and still as friendly as a puppy. As Sarah's belly grew, so did Jake's excitement. He started building a cradle in the evenings, his hands careful and precise as he fitted the pieces together. He talked to the baby constantly, telling stories and singing badly off-key songs that made Sarah laugh. He read to her from newspapers and books, convinced that the baby could hear and was absorbing everything. "You are being ridiculous," Sarah told him fondly. "The baby cannot understand Shakespeare." "You do not know that. Maybe the baby is a genius. Maybe the baby is in there composing sonnets right now. If this baby comes out composing sonnets, I am going to be very concerned." Fall arrived, painting the prairie in shades of gold and russet. The cattle were brought in from summer pasture, and the work of sorting and culling and preparing for winter began. Sarah's due date came and went with no sign of the baby, and she grew increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching and her ankles swollen. Jake hovered, nervous and attentive, driving her slightly crazy with his concern. The baby finally decided to make an appearance on a warm October afternoon nearly 2 weeks late. Sarah's water broke while she was kneading bread dough, and the first contractions started soon after. Jake went pale and looked like he might faint, but he pulled himself together long enough to ride for the midwife in town, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the afternoon and into the night. Mrs. Patterson was a constant reassuring presence, guiding Sarah through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to breathe. Jake stayed by Sarah's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering encouragements and promises. Sarah had never been in so much pain in her life, had never been so exhausted, but every time she thought she could not go on, she would look at Jake's face and find the strength to keep trying. The baby was born just before midnight, sliding into the world with a lusty cry that announced a healthy set of lungs. "It is a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, and Sarah started crying, exhausted and relieved, and overwhelmed with love for the tiny creature the midwife was cleaning and wrapping in a blanket. Jake was crying too, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. Mrs. Patterson placed the baby in Sarah's arms, and Sarah stared down at the small red face, the tiny fingers curled into fists, the wisps of dark hair. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered, because they had decided weeks ago that if the baby was a boy, they would name him after Jake's father. "Welcome to the world." Jake leaned over them both, one arm around Sarah, one finger gently stroking Samuel's cheek. "He is so small," he said in wonder. "I did not realize babies were this small." "All babies are this small," Mrs. Patterson said with amusement. "But do not worry, he will grow fast enough. You will blink, and he will be running around getting into everything." The midwife stayed for a few hours, making sure Sarah and the baby were both stable, showing Jake how to change a diaper and swaddle the baby securely. By the time she left, promising to check back in a few days, the sun was rising over the prairie, painting everything gold. Jake climbed into bed beside Sarah, and they lay there together, Samuel sleeping between them, watching the light grow stronger through the window. "We made this," Jake said softly. "We made this perfect little person." "We did. Somehow we did." "I love you, Sarah Coleman. I loved you from the moment I saw you naming that calf, and I love you more every single day. Thank you for this, for him, for everything. I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes. Samuel stirred, making small snuffling sounds, and Sarah shifted him to her breast to nurse. Jake watched, his expression full of such tender wonder that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again. This was their family. This was their life. And it was more than she had ever dreamed possible. The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings of dirty diapers and baby laughter and learning how to be parents. Uncle Thomas was completely smitten with his great-nephew, riding over every few days to check on them and hold the baby, his gruff exterior melting away when Samuel wrapped a tiny fist around his finger. The ranch hands took turns bringing by gifts, hand-carved toys, and tiny boots and blankets woven by their mothers or sisters. Mercy the cow, now fully grown, seemed fascinated by the baby, always coming to the fence when Sarah carried Samuel out for fresh air. She remembers me, Sarah told Jake. She knows I helped bring her into this world, and now I have brought Samuel into the world too. You have a gift for that, Jake said, kissing her temple, bringing life into the world, making things grow. Sarah thought about that conversation often as Samuel grew from an infant into a toddler, from a toddler into a small boy full of energy and curiosity. She thought about it when she discovered she was pregnant again, this time with a daughter they named Grace, who had Sarah's dark hair and Jake's blue-green eyes. She thought about it when Grace was followed 2 years later by another son, Matthew, who was quieter than his siblings, but just as loved. The years passed in the way years do, each season bleeding into the next, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. Calves were born every spring, and Sarah often helped with difficult births, her reputation as someone who could save a struggling calf spreading to neighboring ranches. Jake expanded his role, eventually becoming a partner with Thomas Whitmore in the ranch operations. They bought more land, increased the herd, and the ranch prospered. Mercy lived to be an old cow, eventually dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 15, a remarkable lifespan for a beef cow. Sarah cried when she found her, remembering that desperate dawn when she had fought to bring Mercy into the world, when Jake had fallen in love with her for naming a calf that could not yet stand. They buried Mercy on the hill above the south pasture, and Jake carved a simple marker that read Mercy, 1877 to 1892. The calf that changed everything. Sarah stood by the grave, Jake's arm around her, and thought about how true those words were. That one moment, that one desperate act of compassion and hope had set everything else in motion, had brought Jake into her life, had given her this family, this home, this love that had sustained her through 15 years and would sustain her through all the years yet to come. Their children grew up strong and capable, learning the ranch business from their father and their great-uncle. Samuel proved to have a gift for horses, able to gentle even the most fractious animal with patience and kindness. Grace was fearless, riding like she was born in the saddle, helping her father with the cattle drives by the time she was 12. Matthew, the quietest of the three, turned out to have a head for numbers and eventually took over managing the ranch's finances. Uncle Thomas passed away in 1895, dying in his sleep at the age of 78. He left the ranch to Jake and Sarah with provisions for their children, and Sarah grieved for the uncle who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, who had given her a chance to prove herself, who had been there for every important moment of her married life. More years passed, and Jake's hair started going gray at the temples, and Sarah noticed lines around her eyes that had not been there before. But they were still in love, still finding joy in each other and in the life they had built. They would sit on their porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the prairie, and Jake would take her hand and say, "Do you remember when you named that calf Mercy?" And Sarah would always smile and say, "I remember. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I knew I loved you, still do, always will. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. By the turn of the century, it was one of the most successful operations in Kansas, known for producing quality cattle and for treating their workers fairly. Samuel brought home a wife in 1898, a smart, capable woman named Alice who fit into the family as if she had always been there. Grace eventually married a neighboring rancher's son, expanding the family's holdings through the alliance. Matthew, to everyone's surprise, ended up marrying a teacher from town, a woman with a college education who taught their future children to read and write with the same dedication Jake and Sarah had poured into raising them. Grandchildren arrived, 7 of them in total, filling the ranch with noise and laughter and chaos. Sarah watched Jake teaching his grandsons to ride, showing his granddaughters how to rope, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for this abundant life. They had started with nothing but love and determination, and they had built something that would last for generations. In 1910, on their 28th wedding anniversary, Jake took Sarah back to the south pasture where they had first met. It was early morning, the same time of day it had been all those years ago, and the light was the same golden quality. They stood on the exact spot where Jake had found Sarah covered in blood and birth fluid, naming a calf that had not yet found its legs. "I still remember exactly how you looked," Jake said, his voice soft with memory. "So fierce, so determined, like you would fight the whole world to keep that calf alive. And when you named her Mercy, something in my chest just cracked wide open. I knew in that moment that I was going to spend the rest of my life with you. Somehow, I just knew." "I thought you were crazy," Sarah admitted, "telling me you loved me when we had just met. But you were right. You knew before I did what this was. Best decision I ever made, telling you how I felt. Did not want to waste a single day pretending I did not know the truth." Sarah leaned into him, fitting against his side the way she had for nearly 3 decades. "I am so glad you found me that morning. I am so glad I decided to check that water trough instead of doing something else. I am so glad for every choice that led me to you. We have had a good life." Sarah Coleman. "The best life, and it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us, God willing. More grandchildren to spoil, more sunsets to watch, more moments like this." Jake kissed her, sweet and slow, the kiss of a man who had been kissing the same woman for 28 years and still found delight in it. When they pulled apart, Sarah saw a calf in the distance, a new one just days old, kicking up its heels and exploring its world. Life continuing, generation after generation, the cycle that had brought them together still spinning forward. They walked back to the ranch house hand in hand, the same way they had walked together for all these years. Their children and grandchildren were there for the anniversary celebration Sarah knew Grace had been planning. Tables set up in the yard with food and decorations. There was music and dancing, stories and laughter. And through it all, Jake never let go of Sarah's hand, anchoring her to him the way he had anchored her since that first impossible moment. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Jake pulled Sarah aside for one more dance. They swayed together to fiddle music, moving slowly, paying more attention to each other than to the rhythm of the song. "Thank you," Jake whispered into her hair, "for saying yes, for taking a chance on a cowboy who fell in love too fast, for building this life with me. Thank you for seeing something in me worth loving, for being patient while I caught up to what you already knew, for giving me a home and a family and a purpose, for everything, Jake, for absolutely everything." The music played on, and they danced in the twilight, surrounded by the people and the place that was their legacy. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and eternal, witness to their love and all the loves that would come after. Mercy's grave stood on the hill, marking the moment that had changed everything, and new calves played in the pastures, representing all the tomorrows still to come. When Sarah finally passed away in 1924 at the age of 69, she died in the bed she had shared with Jake for 42 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Jake held her hand as she slipped away, whispering the same words he had said that very first day. You named that calf before it was even standing, and somehow that made me love you. Still love you, Sarah. Always will. And Sarah, with her last breath, smiled and said, Mercy. I named her Mercy. Jake lived another 3 years, working the ranch until the very end, teaching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren the skills they would need to carry on. He died peacefully in 1927, and they buried him next to Sarah on the hill overlooking the south pasture, near the marker for Mercy the calf. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own stories to the rich tapestry of the place. But the story that was always told, the one that became legend within the family, was the story of how it all began. How a city girl from Philadelphia had come to Kansas with nothing but determination and found a life beyond anything she had imagined. How a cowboy had fallen in love watching her fight for a calf's life, had built a future on that single perfect moment. How love could strike like lightning, fast and true, changing everything in an instant. And every spring when the calves were born, someone would remember to tell the new generation about Mercy, about the calf that was named before she could stand, about the moment that started everything. Because some stories were too important to forget, too precious to lose to time. They were the stories that made a family, that gave meaning to all the work and struggle and joy. They were the stories worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing on. The prairie remained endless and beautiful, witness to countless stories of love and loss and life. The Whitmore-Coleman Ranch prospered through depression and drought, through wars and changing times, because it had been built on something solid, not just land and cattle and hard work, though those were important, but on love, on the kind of love that begins in a moment and lasts forever, on the kind of love that looks at someone covered in blood and birth fluid, fighting desperately for a life that is not their own, and sees everything beautiful in the world. The kind of love that makes you name a calf Mercy, and somehow, impossibly, changes absolutely everything.